Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to Cave the Cross Apologetics. I am Patrick.
And I'm Tony.
And we're on the last portion of our book for Faith Has Its Reasons for the Classical Approach before we move on to our next methodological approach. And so here we've summarized the meta-apologetics of the classical apologist. We've talked about the six different approaches that they have there. Also 6 questions that all apologists have to answer, and summarized what the classical approach offers in terms of that. We've also talked about the strengths that our authors have said tend to be the ones that classical apologists focus on, and lo and behold, reason comes out as being a positive for them, which I don't think we would disagree with. And so now we turn over a new leaf and talk about the weaknesses. Well, it can't be a weakness because this is the one that everyone holds to. Everyone knows the kalam and free will defense. There's really nothing else to do after this. But
well,
actually,
what you find, Patrick, when you turn over a leaf is that there are usually bugs underneath there, right?
Although we do enjoy maybe a little bit more than bugs, our classical apologetic brothers. But so for this episode, we are talking about the potential weaknesses of our classical apologetic brothers, and so it says some of the potential weaknesses here. So during the past 2 centuries, the classical approach has come under increasing fire, both from outside the church and from within, as the near consensus of Christian worldview has been eroded and broken down by the onslaught of secularism and humanism in the West. Many Christians have concluded that the classical approach has some significant problems, or at least limitations.
Right. And so the first thing they want us to do is to see that there are some common criticisms of this approach that are based on clear and outright misunderstanding. So these are false criticisms of the approach that they want us to see first. These are criticisms that they suggest don't even work, right? So classical apologists, for instance, do not claim that one must believe in God or in Christ on the basis of rational arguments to be justified in believing or to have a proper faith. What they maintain is that for such belief to be rational, there must be somewhere a rational ground of that belief in truth, even if the believer may not be aware of that grounding or be able to articulate it, right? Mm-hmm. So notice the idea here is that you don't have to believe or, in God or in Christ on the basis of rational arguments, right? They're believers that believe that don't know any arguments or don't know any good arguments, but that doesn't mean that they can't have belief in Christ, right? And so the claim that classicalists say you have to believe based on rational arguments is a misnomer. It misses what they're attempting to say, right? It's a misunderstanding of the approach.
Yeah. Plantinga's warrant of Christian belief is one, and that even Craig holds highly in regard as far as here. And again, Craig talks about the knowing and the showing difference as being a Christian, as you can know that you're a Christian, but to show you're a Christian, he would point to rationality as being the prime mover of people. Well, likewise, classical apologetics does not substitute reason for faith. We're just automatons of reason. We write down our premise 1, premise 2, then a conclusion, and whatever happens in there, that's the only wiggle room for faith is moving to your conclusion. Well, classical apologists regard some of the belief as essential to sound faith to be demonstrated by reason, but faith itself includes beliefs that cannot be demonstrated. And again, what is the main definition of faith? It's trust, and to when we do our terrible trust falls that you don't trust people at your job site, but you still have to do it because HR is telling you to. You're trusting the people behind you to have your back, and so that's what the purpose allegedly of that demonstration is for. And so when Jesus says, "I'm the way, the truth, and life, no man can come to the Father except through me," well, the trust is in the coming to the Father through him. What titration, what scratch test, what malleable property can we put on that? How can we demonstrate that through a law of non-contradictions? Unless if Jesus said, you can go anywhere you want, just not through me. That would be a contradiction in terms. But no, we have to trust that Jesus is the way, that he will be faithful, that he will be trustworthy in that demonstration of his power, and he's evidenced us that by his resurrection and everything that's happened from there. Well, moreover, faith is more than an assent of the mind to beliefs. It is a response of the will to God. And this is something that reason cannot produce. Right.
And so the classical apologist says faith is more than just this rational kind of belief. There's a volitional aspect of it, a response of the will to God. And so when we say that, well, the classical apologist is saying that, it's only this rational thing. No, it's more than that. And they understand that it's more than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In fact, if you look at people who mapped the human genome, you had people that from those groups that went from completely atheist to at least theistic, and saying, listen, all I did was put A, B's and C's and a few E's in this lineup, and all of a sudden I have a belief system here that is unattainable by me anymore, and that's of no designer. And so I see design in this. Now, did that person sit down and write out their premise and conclusion? Well, no, it seems to be an experiential form of the work that they produced in order to get them to that belief. And you do have Christians who have come out of that as well. But I'm talking just in particular here of a single person.
Yeah, good. And so our authors tell us that while such misplaced criticism should definitely be set aside, we should give careful consideration to other concerns that critics have voiced about the classical approach. And so they want to highlight for us 3 of these concerns with regard to the classical approach. So let's kind of jump in here and work our way through these. So the first one, they tell us, is that classical apologists overestimates the adequacy of reason as a criterion for truth. And so they suggest, as valuable as reason or logic is in apologetics, many Christian apologists express reservations about the primacy and comprehensive use of reason, and in particular, deductive logic in classical apologetics. And so with regard to this, they say that we can distinguish 3 concerns under this general heading of the overestimation of the adequacy of reason.
Right. So first, logic, though universally necessary, is universally insufficient as a criterion for truth. This is because, at best, deductive logic can only test the falsity of a worldview and cannot actually determine that a worldview is true. So you can falsify it, but once you falsified it, is yours true? Well, yeah, not necessarily the case. Well, this is because a deductive argument, even if formally correct or valid, is assured of arriving at true conclusions only if the premise is true. So you have, if it rains, the sidewalk is wet. The sidewalk is wet, therefore it must have rained. Well, unless the sprinkler's turned on. So right. You have to go back and talk about your premise if that's true, if there's other explanations in there. Now, what deductively let out is true, right? If it follows from the premises, but it's not the only explanation. So we have to go back to the premise. And so that's what people have sometimes a hard time with, is you're always having to talk about the premise being true. And in fact, in debates, William Lane Craig said, if you grant me the premises as true, then this has to follow. Now, we can talk about the premises not being true, but you have to say from this criteria that the conclusion must be true from these premises. And so,
right. And so I think that the illustration there is, if it rains and the sidewalk is wet, it rained, therefore the sidewalk is wet. So that's modus ponens.
Oh, there you go.
And it's right. And so that is a valid deductive structure. The question with regard to the truthfulness of the premises. And probably a better illustration, I think they don't use this one, but here's one that, if you study any logic, the kind of simple type of way to show this is all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. So the issue here is, if indeed all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, then of necessity, Socrates must be mortal. But the problem that I think our authors are trying to show here is the issue of, even though that may be a deductively valid argument, how do we show the truthfulness of the premises? How do we know that all men are mortal? Have we seen all men, past, present, and future, and somehow observe that? So, how do we determine the truthfulness of the premises is the issue I think that they're getting at here. Mm-hmm. And so as a result of that, then logic itself isn't necessarily sufficient criterion of truth, I think is what they're saying.
Right.
Notice this is a kind of a criticism of deductive logic, right? Sometimes we make this distinction there's a distinction between deductive logic and inductive logic. Mm-hmm. And people say, well, I'd rather have deductive logic because it's necessity. It confirms, it gives us truth, mm-hmm. while induction is just probability. Right. The problem is usually with regard to deductive logic, in order to show that the premises are true, many times we have to give an inductive argument, right? We have to show, well, all men that we've seen so far are mortal, mm-hmm. right? And so probably all men are mortal, right? And so now that induction is based on a probability argument for one of the premises. And so if that's the case, then we don't have this this absolute necessity that we want from a deductive argument. And so I think that's part of the criticism here that mm-hmm. they're getting at. It results in, at least to a certain degree, some type of probability argument.
Right. We all know that Socrates was actually a robot sent from the future, so therefore he's not a man, and therefore we know that's not true.
Yeah. So that's a criticism of the second premise, right? So you can get all of these. Yeah. You can get both of them.
So ultimately, the premise of an apologetic argument must consist of facts derived from some source other than logical analysis, and that seems to go against what our classical apologist proponents want to validate.
Right. And so, they do say that classical apologists during the past couple centuries have recognized that, apologetic arguments cannot produce on the basis of reason alone, accomplish what they want. And once it's recognized that reason does not suffice as a criterion of truth, one must then decide what criteria will be used in the apologetic argument. And they point out that this raises the second difficulty for the classical approach's attempt to find universal sufficient criteria for determining truth. There appear to be no universal accepted criteria of truth that can be applied without already assuming the truth of, notice, a particular worldview, right? So the worldview establishes, they're suggesting, the criteria. And so once you get outside of that, then, of course, naked logic, we might say, doesn't seem to work for them. That's the issue here that they want us to see.
Well, I wonder if there's any other worldview or any other apologetic methods that talk about that.
Well, we'll see, right?
We'll see. Yeah, absolutely. We're only on the first one.
That's right.
It's was it Wink Martindale? You got to learn all your choices before you press your luck there. All right. Well, third, the emphasis on logical analysis has come under fire for presuming that human reasoning is capable of recognizing truth about God. Apologists and theologians outside the classical tradition often complain that classical apologetics assumes that God and his relation to the world are susceptible to logical analysis and descriptions by finite minds. This assumption appears to fly in the face of God's infinitude and transcendence. So how dare you say that you're able, with your puny mind, to know the mind of God?
Right. Yeah. And moreover, they tell us even if it's possible for Christians to perceive the logical coherence of their beliefs about God, it does not follow that non-Christians will be able to perceive that coherence, right? The classical approach, they tell us, assumes that the application of logical categories to God is a neutral, objective manner on which Christians and non-Christians can agree. Now, obviously, apologists outside the classical tradition question this assumption, right?
Right.
There is, they insist, no epistemological neutrality. And of course, we'll see that with a vengeance when we get further on down the road, right? And looking at some of these others, right? So, is there neutrality, and can we, come to God based on a neutral basis of logic or whatever? And perhaps not. And so that's kind of the issue here that's being raised.
Right. And again, the emphasis on reason, and we can't approach our Bible yet because we haven't gone through our apologetic method, and then we do our apologists and then our theology. So, it's a little bit hard pressed to point to a revelatory source here, because for classical apologists, reason is going to be the key mover here. All right, and then our authors move on to depends on theistic arguments of debated validity and value. The theistic arguments of natural theology have inherent limitations that make them a dubious foundation for apologetics in the eyes of many Christian thinkers. First, the opinion of many Christian apologists, there are reasons to question whether the traditional theistic proofs are sound.
Yeah. So do these traditional theistic proofs work? Are they sound, right? Do they accomplish what the classicalists suggest that they do?
Right.
So they quote Mark Hanna here, and he speaks for many when he writes this. Beginning with a mere concept of God, so this would be the ontological argument, one cannot validly infer the extra conceptual or actual existence of God. Right. So that's a criticism of the ontological argument. The next is a criticism of the cosmological argument. Beginning with a finite world, one cannot deductively arrive at an infinite God. So in spite of the great ingenuity, expended in attempts to frame a sound theistic argument, none has escaped the charge of smuggling in question-begging assumptions. So this is a quote from Mark Hanna, right? So the claim here is that none of the theistic arguments is sound, is perhaps, our authors tell us, the most critical objection to classical arguments. If the truth of theism cannot be established as a philosophical starting point, right? The cosmological argument, the teleological argument, that sort of thing, for presenting the evidences for Christianity, then the classical model is clearly fundamentally flawed, right?
Yeah.
So that seems to be a problem here. Not everyone accepts these arguments as as a way to show that God exists.
Yeah, big claim there. A second limitation is that even if they are sound, the theistic arguments are often exceedingly complicated and beyond the grasp of most people. So, you talk about prime mover and logical necessities, and you start using Latin terms and a priori. Whoa. Hold on.
I just want to know if God existed.
Yeah. Just give it to me simple. I shouldn't have to do all this hard thinking for the idea of that God exists. Well, third, even if the arguments are sound, and it has been pointed out that they do not lead to a personal God of Christian theism. Again, that's where the two-step approach comes into, but that's also the flaw of the two-step. Is okay, you've found a pattern of communication in the DNA structure. We're able to codify it and label it and manipulate it, and so it looks like it points to a Zioner. Which one? And is he still around? Are we sure he's revealed himself, or is this just it? Is this panspermia of a small g god, or is this is this one of the thousands that Hindus have come up with, or is this one of the millions that the Mormons believe? So we don't quite know that yet.
Right. And of course, you know, the classicals would say, well, we have two steps and now we have to show the Christian God. But still, the first step doesn't get us where we want it to get us, right? A prime mover or a first cause. Well, what does that have to do with the personal God? You have to go more than that. And so the issue here is just these arguments. That's what our authors are trying to say. They don't do the work that it seems like the classical apologist wants them to do or believes that they do. All right, and then the last kind of criticism here that they level is that the classical approach does not address the personal dimension of knowledge and belief. They tell us that classical apologists are concerned as a practical matter to persuade non-Christians to believe in Christ, as is evidence in their emphasis on finding common ground with unbelievers. But on the other hand, common ground for classical apologists is typically understood as rational or intellectual, right? That's the common ground. We have common rational faculties, or intellectual faculties, or reason is the common ground. And so this focus, they tell us, is widely perceived as a weakness in the classical approach because it overlooks the personal, non-rational factors that contribute to a person's knowledge and belief. Commitment to ultimate philosophical perspectives, they tell us, is not merely intellectual. It is also influenced by our feelings, our emotions, and the decisions of our will, volitional factors. And so it's more than just, the head is what they're suggesting here. And so the criticism here is that the classical approach does not address the personal dimensions of knowledge and belief with this focus on the rational and the intellectual.
Leonard Nimoy titled one of his first books that he wrote, "I Am Not Spock," but he could have titled it, "We Are All Not Spock." Even those of us who really like Spock, we can't break free from our emotional and volitional factors here. And so, no matter how hard we try to always be rational, sometimes there's that one news story that just gets you hot under the collar, and you start ranting and raving, or you see your favorite sports ball team win or lose, and you don't take a rational look at it and throw it through modus ponens and come out the other side and go, why, yes, the Lions, of course, are inevitably going to lose every single game for the next 1,000 years. It's inevitable. Well, we should repeat the points that the potential weaknesses in the classical approach are not criticisms of all classical apologists, our authors say. And that is true because, we talked about even when we looked at the people, and even Norman Geisler, who is the epitome of all classical apologists, according to our authors, probably doesn't hold to every single point perfectly. And so there are people that still identify with classical apologists, but may not hold to every single criticism here. Most of the accomplished apologists in this tradition nuance their approach to overcome or at least ameliorate some of all of these difficulties. Sometimes that's a hard thing to do, and sometimes people in the camp want to kick you out of the camp, and then no one else will take you, so you create your own thing, or you call it you just call it new. It's the NEO, the new version of Calvinism. It's the new version of classical apologists. And so I will say here too that our authors have listed these things as our negatives, and so we might also, as you've probably come to realize, kind of view also our negatives in here as well. I think putting the Bible last as what is being presented here. I'm also not saying here that every apologist or classical apologist will do that as well. But how do you know what God to argue if you're going to say, from your logic, then proceeds apologetics, and then proceeds our look at the Bible? And so here's where other approaches, I think, do a better job of presenting what Christians actually do come to a more considerate worldview of what they're actually arguing for. But that's not to say that the classical apologists have nothing to offer. Again, from wherever you're at, you can still argue the Kalam argument, and it's still fascinating. And it's great that Craig has done so much work in it, and there's a lot to be looked at here. And so we're not kicking them out of the kingdom. At least I'm not. I don't have that power or authority, and so there's a lot to be desired here. But also there's good things to learn, and to just discount reason and logic. I don't think anyone really wants to do that. Even the fetus doesn't quite want to go that far. But it just seems here that the two-step approach misses a lot when it comes to what Christians are actually trying to argue, what a majority of also Christians are trying to get at. And it's a weird approach where we say, if there is no neutrality, then why are we giving the unbeliever the spot to be neutral? They're not giving you the spot to be neutral, nor are you neutral, right? You honestly can't lay aside and say, let us reason up from our mental faculties and say, come, let us reason together. Maybe there's a God. Well, hold on. How do we even take that terminology to task? We're trying to communicate something. We're trying to communicate to something else. We're trying to reach a transcendent or someone who once was us. And so then what form of God are you arguing to? It seems like you're putting the cart before the horse, but you're actually not, and you're saying that you are. And so that seems to be a big critique that we would have, at least of this approach.
Yeah, good. All right, so they conclude this chapter by pointing out a couple of things here. First, they say that the classical model of Christian apologetics has some significant strengths, and of course, we've seen some of these, right? It emphasizes the importance of logic, which is important, and the need for an interpretive framework or worldview from which, within which facts gain meaning, and of course, it emphasizes the value of finding common ground with non-Christians. So those are some significant strengths that they suggest that this particular approach has.
On the other hand, the classical approach is beset by certain potential limitations, which are often raised as objections to the entire approach. Of these, three stand out. First, the arguments used in classical apologetics tends to treat their criteria for testing the truth of Christianity as a neutral criteria that can be objectively and correctly employed by Christians and non-Christians alike to determine truth. That doesn't seem to be the case. Such neutrality would appear to be impossible. People come to the table with different ideas already formed about what is reasonable, what is factual, what is practical, what is important. Maybe they're just wrong about it, and so they don't view it as important or as logical. And so it seems like all these different factors come in to creating an in-neutral starting place for everybody. And again, if we take the Bible for what it says, it appears that neutrality is a very hard-pressed point to make when it comes to what's revealed to us in Scripture.
Yeah, good. And secondly, they tell us the soundness of arguments, that is, these various arguments for the existence of God, used to establish theism as a true worldview, is debated, right? Not everybody accepts it. And even those found to be sound are too abstract and complex to help most people, right? What in the world are you talking about, right? This, first cause. What is that? That's not the God I thought you were talking about. And then thirdly, classical apologetics, they tell us, tends to overlook the non-rational personal factors that affect people's beliefs.
So in reaction to these and other difficulties, most Christian apologists today working from essentially classical model moderate or qualify that approach. Thus, the aforementioned weaknesses do not apply to all apologists who operate within the classical tradition. On the other hand, other Christian apologists have sought to develop alternative approaches to defending the faith. And in the next section, we will consider one of the most closely related to the classical approach, and that is of evidentialism. So you'll probably see a lot of the same things that were talked about, at least in the later portion of our classical approach. And then we go out in left field and talk about those crazy people that have beliefs that aren't, or apologetic approaches that don't align with these two.
Right, exactly.
So evidentialist is where you want to go from classical approach, just because the two are very closely related and treads familiar territory, but it's not a one-to-one correlation at all. And again, I highly recommend the 5 views of Christian apologetics from Zondervan that really illustrate the dialogue, or I guess it'd be the quantologue, but the different approaches here. Although they don't really talk to each other, they write to each other, which is actually really interesting for discerning a little bit more truth from a debate process, which is really interesting. We'll talk about that later.
All right. So until next time, we'll see you then.
Yeah. So the next episodes that you might encounter will probably be 1 or 2, maybe from the evidential ones. And then we get towards the end of the year, if you're watching this in the present, which is our future. And then you might be looking at the past. So here we're hitting the B theory of time, I think. So what I tend to do to give us some breathing room around the holidays is I just do the reviews that of the books that I've read for the year. I've tried for 52 this year. And so depending on where I'm at, you'll either get 52 or less than that. And so those will kind of be the episodes towards the end of the year. And then from wherever that happens, once we decide, then we'll pick back up at the first of the year by looking more at our evidential approach. But we still might cover some episodes here from Our Faith Has Its Reasons by Kenneth Boa and Robert M. Bowman Jr. that you should definitely pick up and read along with us. So we thank you for joining us, and hopefully you found this valuable. Tell us what you think about classical approach. What do you think its strengths are? What do you think its weaknesses are? Let's talk about it in the crazy YouTube comments. That's always fun to wake up to and figure out what I'm going to argue about for that day. But as always, we thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.